belittling. But we have a special guest, Dr. Kingsley Moghalu, Deputy Governor from the Nigerian Central Bank, who recently unveiled his latest book, Emerging Africa, How the Global Economy's Last Frontier Can Prosper and Matter. The book offers an assessment of Africa's economic development trajectory within the context of contemporary threats and opportunities in the global economy. To discuss the book, we have the Deputy Governor in studio with us. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Let's start with our biggest challenge as you see it.
Well, I think the biggest challenge that African countries face as they strive to become economically relevant in a globalized world is to understand, first of all, the concept and the context of globalization, as an operating theater. So I think that's a very important challenge. I think African countries need to develop a clear philosophical underpinning of their quest for prosperity, and to understand exactly where they're going, how they're going to get there, and why they want to go to where they're going. I do see a lot of conventional wisdoms, a lot of myths, and in this book I explore and explode some of those myths, whether it's globalization, capitalism, foreign investment. You'll be pleasantly surprised with some of the conclusions and analysis.
Lindsay's going to pick it up before Adrian comes in.
Dr. Moghalu, thanks very much for joining us. So you say that, I haven't had the privilege of reading your book, but I'm looking at some of the points here. It says here, capitalism, you say, is the worst out of all economic systems. Does that make you a socialist? Can you explain that comment?
I said it's the worst of all economic systems except for all the rest.
Ah, that was a very valuable context that was missing there. I'm getting Adrian to come. I'm passing the baton here to Adrian. Lindsay.
In terms of, you've suggested some ways in which the subcontinent progresses. I'd be interested to know first, though, your views on what's held the region back. Because here, too, I think there's as much myth as reality. Yeah. What are the things that the region has to get rid of before it can advance?
Yeah, I think the region has to get rid of a number of things, such as, and that's beginning to happen, an excessive reliance on foreign aid as a driver of development. That's just not true. There is no empirical evidence that aid has created development anywhere in Africa. So that's one of the mindsets that flat out must be dropped.
And this is all forms of aid, not just specific forms?
Well, especially structural aid. Okay. Obviously, if you have a humanitarian disaster, there's nothing wrong with people coming to the aid of the victims.
Sure.
But then also, I think it's very important to drop the conventional wisdom that the state must get out of the way completely. No. It's important that we have private sector-led growth, but the guiding hand of the state is very important. It is the duty of the state to create an environment and a context in which capitalism can drive economic growth. Otherwise, if that's not the case, you begin to have huge questions of inequality. You begin to have a question of the wealth of individuals, but not the wealth of nations.
And when you make reference to this functional state, it's as much philosophical as it is practical, I imagine.
Yes, indeed it is, because the point I'm trying to make is that there are philosophical foundations of prosperity everywhere in the world that has prospered. And Africa cannot be any different. If you look at the United States, there is a certain worldview that has driven their economic system. If you look at China today and most of Asia, there is a certain worldview that drives their economic development. It's a different worldview from the West, but nevertheless has delivered results. So I think it's Africa's duty to really look a little bit more deeply within itself and their societies to see how to drive their economic development by having fundamental understandings about the nature of the world.
Shelo, let's bring you in here.
But isn't that the question? How do you help governments, or how do governments help themselves to have that fundamental understanding of the world?
Yeah.
What prevents them from generating legislative creativity? What prevents them from negotiating better trade agreements with foreign partners? What prevents them from producing or generating a wonderful environment for the private sector to lead growth?
That's right.
What's the problem there?
The problem, I say, is an unwillingness, a reluctance to think it through, a reluctance to think a little bit more deeply. Let me just give you a practical example. You said, what prevents them from negotiating beneficial trade agreements? Now, if you don't understand the nature of the international system, and you're going into the negotiations on trade, and you believe falsely that it's an even playing field, or that you're a member of some wonderfully welcoming international community in which everybody has sort of lost their self-interest, you're going in with self-deceit. And that can create wrong negotiating outcomes. You need to have national interest criteria from which, as a base, you begin to negotiate internationally. And this, one of the results of this is we've seen African countries accept the liberalization of global trade without questioning it. And what happened was that it ended up deindustrializing most of Africa, because all their borders were opened up without restrictions, and some of the people who were telling them to open their borders were busy protecting theirs.
You say that three of Africa's biggest obstacles are that need to be addressed are urgently philosophical understanding of free markets, and also you said in a previous answer, Doctor, you said the guiding hand of the state is important. Is it the case that the state itself in many countries in Africa, and in fact across the whole continent, don't have a philosophical understanding of free markets, and that is one of the things that's holding us back? We need the guiding hand of the state, but if essentially they don't understand the things that you've been talking about.
Yes, indeed. I argue in the book that it is the case in many African countries that a sufficient or adequate understanding philosophically of the concept of capitalism and free markets, while everybody is now a free marketeer, that is lacking. And without such an understanding, for example, what's the implication of state capitalism? What's the implication of welfare capitalism? What's the implication of entrepreneurial capitalism? What's the implication of oligarchic or crony capitalism? These are the kinds of discussions that public policy in African countries needs to be interrogating. And I don't see enough of this. And that's what I'm saying in the book.
When we talk of sub-Saharan Africa, there's a tendency to speak of sub-Saharan Africa as a place, and of course it isn't. It's more
54
than
countries.
Yeah, so we've got this vast collection of countries that makes up the region.
Absolutely.
Some, I imagine, are performing well relative to the criteria you set out in emerging Africa, and others are lagging. I'd be interested to know what your assessment is of South Africa, Nigeria, and who you would put at the top of the list right now.
Well, I'll start with Nigeria, naturally. I mean, I'm from Nigeria. I'm Deputy Governor of Nigeria's Central Bank. And I think that what we are seeing in Nigeria is actually a turning point where a number of structural reforms are taking place. Reforms in the electric power sector, reforms in which individuals are moving to establish refineries. And when this happens, I think the excessive reliance on a natural resource of oil can be turned to advantage by creating a manufacturing economy. And so I see definitely signs of hope emerging on the horizon for Nigeria, which is actually the leading Africa growth story moving into the near future, without question.
Let's touch on the skills deficit, which you highlight in Africa as being of key concern, but you've got solutions.
Yes.
And you're saying we can make this a lucrative, attractive area to retain and attract skills.
Yes.
What are those solutions?
One of the solutions is, as we pursue foreign investments, or as we pursue investments, whether foreign or domestic, we need to understand that investing in building human capital is one of the most foundational investments we can make if we expect to have sustainably growing economies, or even to achieve economic transformation. If you look at the countries that have achieved economic transformation, whether it's China, whether it's Singapore, whether it's Malaysia, you find an emphasis on the acquisition of skills, especially technical skills, because that's what underpins industrial and manufacturing production. So in sub-Saharan African countries, I think you can pursue it both internally and from the perspective of foreign investment. Encourage investments in those areas because you have a strategy of channeling investment to your priority areas for economic transformation. And I argue that human capital development ought to be one of those priority areas of investment, not our oil, not our uranium, not our platinum. No, human capital development.
I spoke to somebody who attended the Berkshire Hathaway AGM, this annual meeting they have, Doctor, where Warren Buffett talks about his investments and his philosophies. And there was apparently, I can't corroborate this, but there was apparently a question about Africa, and he almost brushed it aside. And there are still Afro-pessimists out there. In fact, in the last couple of days, I've spoken to a fund manager who says he thinks that the whole Africa story is overblown, and we've seen these false starts before. What would you say to these continuingly Afro-pessimists about that a full storm theory?
Well, I think there is some merit in it without being an Afro-pessimist myself. You know, my book is not the book of lamentations, and it's not the book of platitudes either. I think that we need to be very careful when we assess the Africa growth story and not celebrate prematurely. We have indeed seen false starts. 60 years ago, 50 years ago, when African countries were becoming independent, we all felt that African countries had arrived. 50 years later, we know what happened. We don't want to be we don't want the opportunity we have right now to turn into another false start. And that's why I have written this book, to say the things we should do to prevent this opportunity, this turning point we have now, from being a false start. And that's where Warren Buffett is wrong, because there is nothing to say that it is written in the stars that Africa cannot rise.
Gentlemen, a closing comment or question? Adrian Lowe?
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'd still like to go back to my earlier question in terms of my ranking. I'd be interested to know who you would put at the top of the list right now. Who do you think is sort of shaping themselves for success?
Nigeria.
Yeah. Well, I talked about Nigeria, but aside from Nigeria,
you're not allowed a home vote.
Yes, I think quite clearly that the economies in East Africa are doing rather well, from what I can see. Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and to some extent Tanzania. I think these countries are actually doing very well. They are investing pretty much in the right things. A lot of emphasis on skills development, especially in Ethiopia. And in Ethiopia, a cautious entry into free markets by weighing the interest of the state, the collective interest, against the interest of capital and capitalists. I think a happy medium can be found between the two. So I see a lot of progress in that part of Africa.
And that's fascinating, because that's a region rather than just a country.
Well, actually, yes, it is. It is indeed.
Shelo?
Well, you know, one can never argue against skills development by any means whatsoever, but look at Botswana, which from 1966 to up until today, I think has invested the most in its own people, free education. The bulk of the country is educated, but the country is slipping into oblivion. For a while it was celebrated. What do you pair education with?
Yes, good question. Yes. Now, what you pair education with, when I discuss education and skills development, I'm discussing it as a foundation, not in isolation. There are many societies with high levels of literacy and education which are still poor. But I pair it with the entrepreneurial drive that we are seeing emerge and unleash itself in the African continent. It's the combination of those two things that will create wealth.
Well, Dr. Moghalu, we look forward to seeing you in a Business Tonight studio again on South African soil. That was Dr. Kingsley Moghalu, Deputy Governor of the Nigerian Central Bank and author of Emerging Africa, How the Global Economy's Last Frontier Can Prosper and Matter. We're heading into a short break. More Business Tonight right after this.